Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this Wednesday night, September 9, 2015 edition of Nightcast. At least 2 people in Lebanon have died after a sandstorm engulfed parts of the country as well as regions of Syria, Israel, and Jordan. Cities across the region have been covered in orange dust. It's even resulted in fighting in Syria being disrupted due to the visibility. Ben Bland reports.
Getting around by car or by foot, the sandstorm is disrupting daily life in the Lebanese capital, Beirut. The government says more than 700 people have been hospitalized with breathing difficulties. At least 2 are known to have died.
Old people and asthma patients are being admitted because of the dust getting into their lungs, and we are treating them.
Meanwhile, in neighbouring Syria, the capital Damascus was engulfed in clouds of dust. And this, thought to be in the north of the country, a refugee camp also hit by the storm. Even the fighting has been disrupted. Visibility so poor that fewer airstrikes were carried out. In Jordan, warmer than average temperatures added to the difficulties. Breathing masks were being handed out and some schools were shut. And in Israel, tourists sightseeing, or trying to, though much of Jerusalem's old city was itself masked in a sandy haze. Across the region, people are being advised to stay indoors if possible until the sandstorm eases towards the later part of this week. Ben Bland, BBC News.
And friends, from the United States, 2 men who were passengers on a British Airways flight from Las Vegas have been describing the moment their plane caught fire moments before takeoff.
There were some passengers that were saying, there's a fire, and as soon as the crew heard passengers saying there was a fire, there was no hesitation from them whatsoever. The exit doors were open, they were literally in full swing. It was like clockwork for them.
I was one of the first people off the plane and so jumped down the slide, and I looked up and the flames seemed to be about twice the height of the aircraft. This was before the fire trucks arrived. They also came very quickly. They were probably only about 150 metres away whenever I was running out away from the flames.
I could smell the horrible burning smell in the cabin, and I heard somebody had said that they could sort of see their windows slightly melting. We went to the middle exit on the right, but that opened and the smoke came in, and the stewardess told us to back off and use the front exit.
You've heard the distress signal that the pilot, said to the base, and it was very calm and collected, and that really summed up the behaviour of all the crew. As soon as that order was given to evacuate, it was like clockwork, and as soon as one option didn't work with the emergency exit, they were on to another, so it was absolutely fantastic.
All 172 people were evacuated from the airliner. 13 people have been treated for minor injuries, and those you heard speaking were Dominic Worthington, Shane McArdle, Jeremy Turnbull, and Dave Willey, all who were on that plane. The talk of the town, Washington, on Wednesday, today, was the deal over Iran's nuclear program. Presidential candidates on opposing sides expressed their opinions. Some defended the agreement, but others voiced scathing criticism. Barbara Klett-Usher reports.
Oh my gosh.
News just in. More senators have thrown their weight behind the Iran deal, a crucial number.
Can you believe it?
That's exhilarating for activists fighting an uphill battle.
It is beyond anything we could have imagined.
Today's a heck of a day for peace, huh?
President Obama's now got enough support to squeeze the deal through Congress. He might even be spared having to veto a resolution disapproving it. But that doesn't mean the debate is over. Far from it.
It blocks every pathway for Iran to get a bomb.
Despite the sound and fury in Congress this week, the real battleground is shifting to the presidential election, and the big guns are out. Today, Donald Trump, the bombastic Republican frontrunner, brought his showmanship to a rally against the deal, choosing his music to match his message.
Never, ever, ever in my life have I seen any transaction so incompetently negotiated as our deal with Iran. And I mean never.
All of the Republican candidates agree. They present the deal as the greatest national security threat facing the nation, and they'll continue pushing that theme with sympathetic audiences. Setting down her marker, Hillary Clinton reassured allies she'd stick with the deal if she replaces Obama. But she told Americans she'd be tough on Iran if it tried to cheat.
As president, I will take whatever actions are necessary to protect the United States and our allies. I will not hesitate to take military action if Iran attempts to obtain a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, just like she did when the ambassador Stevens was in trouble.
That's important for people at this rally, because many Americans do see Iran as a real threat. As an enemy, for instance, that shipped the explosives to Iraq, which blew off this soldier's legs.
An America that I grew up in has never been a country that's looked on to evil and done nothing about it.
It's one reason this debate is so passionate and contentious.
I oppose implementation of this deal.
And why the vote will be historic, even if the result is already known. What's not known is what's behind the rhetoric. Are the Republicans just talking big to cover up their failure to stop the deal? Or are they seriously committed to reversing it if they get to the White House? President Obama's signature foreign policy achievement won't be safe until that question is answered. Barbara Platt-Usher, BBC News, Washington.
Okay, friends, listen, there is a scripture, all seriously, there is a scripture that talks about, in the end time, women and children ruling over you. The children part talking about foreigners, as it's been explained to us. And makes sense. And the past 8 years, we've had essentially a foreigner, a Muslim, ruling over this country. And as he promised, change. And since we are to have women ruling over us, I would anticipate that could indicate, in spite of the best wishes of Republicans, we may see Hillary. But I don't want to get into politics too much. We have to wait and see what God's got in mind, because he says he puts in office the basest of men. We've certainly seen that for the past many years, and in both parties, we've seen the basest of men operating. And what's happening essentially is God, since the Garden of Eden, God has allotted man 6,000 years to write the lesson in history of eating off the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, deciding for yourself right and wrong. Man trying to govern himself without God. And that's going to write the lesson that, as Jesus Christ explains in Matthew 24, verses 20, 21, 22, around there, when he's talking about the great tribulation, a time of trouble so great that no time of trouble since the beginning of the world has ever been as bad as what's coming. In the next major event to happen in prophecy, the fifth seal of Revelation. Let me just put the chart on the screen. Well, let me switch gears here. We come back to this one and get over to another bank of buttons so I can do this. Okay, we'll put this chart up just real quickly. These are the first 5 of 7 seals mentioned in the book of Revelation. The first 4 are active now. Most of our news stories relate to these 4 seals in some way. And the 5th seal, you see on the right side of your screen, which is labeled the Great Tribulation, or Great Tribulation, has a guillotine at the top and the number 5 for the 5th seal. That's the time Jesus Christ is talking about. He calls the Great Tribulation in plain language a time of trouble so bad that no time since the beginning of the world nor ever after is going to be as bad as what's coming in this next major event to happen in prophecy. These first 4 seals are happening right now. And the next news story relates in several ways to this 4th seal. We park on the 4th seal beside disease epidemics and pestilence and the plagues of Egypt. That was the main thing Jesus Christ described by calling it loimus. He also said this between the 3rd and 5th seal would be seismus, commotions in the air, gale force winds of all kind, and commotions on the ground, all kind of earth seismas, quakes, volcanic eruptions, wildfires, floods, tsunamis, etc. And he also said in Mark 13, verse 8, only in Mark, he said there would be trouble. Not your mega trouble, not the great tribulation trouble of the 5th seal, but trouble that leads up to that trouble. Mobs, seditions, that kind of thing. Now, our next story relates in that sense of trouble, mob, sedition, so on. The UN Refugee Agency has warned Hungary to expect an additional 40,000 migrants by the end of next month as people move north from Greece and Serbia. Hungary has been struggling to process all those crossing its territory on their way to northern Europe. The BBC's European correspondent Anna Halligan reports from the Serbia-Hungary border.
So these are some of the people who've just escaped from the camp on the border over there. Some of them have tried to make a desperate run for it through the fields behind. You can see the line of police here. Many of these families are running for their lives, escaping war in Syria. This is the first time that we've seen them come down this far. The police are trying to contain them in this area. We saw some riot police earlier. The refugees, though, have scattered. Some of them have even walked down the motorway in the direction of Serbia, which is where they came from. It's certainly not where they want to go back to. Most of these people want to continue their journey on westwards towards Vienna and then ultimately Germany. For many of them, is the promised land. This is just a small fraction of the people who are crossing all the time. 40,000 people are expected to arrive in Hungary this week alone. 660 children arrived here on Monday, and you can see behind us the police are preparing. They've seen so many police, and much worse, that none of them seem very fazed by what's happening around them.
Thank you, Anna. The European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker has announced plans that he says will offer a swift, determined, and comprehensive response to Europe's migrant crisis. Under the proposals, 120,000 additional asylum seekers will be distributed among EU nations with binding quotas. It comes after a surge of thousands of mainly Syrian migrants pushed north through Europe in recent days. Chris Morris reports.
And still they come. Another flood tide of people leaving the Greek islands and heading further north. No sign of complacency in Strasbourg, where Jean-Claude Juncker was giving his first State of the Union speech. We're not in a good place, he admitted. There's a lack of Europe and a lack of union.
I do not want, Mr. President, to create any illusions that the refugee crisis will be over anytime soon. It will not, and we have to know that. But pushing back boats from piers, setting fire to refugee camps, or turning a blind eye to poor and helpless people, that is not Europe.
And so the European Commission is proposing a response. It wants 160,000 refugees who've recently arrived in Italy, Greece and Hungary to be relocated to 22 other EU countries. A permanent system put in place to deal with future mass arrivals. and asylum seekers to be given the right to work immediately. Some countries have been adamantly opposed to mandatory quotas for refugees, but officials here say they think the scheme will be approved.
Relocating migrants across Europe is just one part of a broader strategy to try to deal with this crisis. There will be greater effort to deport people whose asylum applications fail, a new policy on legal migration, and a trust fund to help tackle the root causes of migration from Africa. But critics will still say it's too little too late.
Some want Europe to do more, others want it to do less, or question its very basis.
If we want to help genuine refugees, if we want to protect our societies, if we want to stop the criminal trafficking gangs from benefiting as they are, we must stop the boats coming.
The scenes are unsettling, and for many European politicians and citizens, this is about what kind of Europe we want. Chris Morris, BBC News, Strasbourg.
Europe has been struggling for months on how to handle the influx of migrants bring in from conflict areas in the Middle East and Africa. The European Commission is set to announce plans today, you heard some of it in the video we just played, to distribute 120,000 migrants among member countries. A similar debate has been brewing in the U.S., where lawmakers are calling for the government to welcome 65,000 migrants from Syria. Admiral James Stavridis says that that's not enough. The former NATO Supreme Allied Commander and current Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University said the U.S. should accept 100,000 migrants to lessen Europe's load.
Admiral Stavridis, is there a military solution that you can see which would end the killing in Syria that's fueling the exodus of refugees through neighbouring countries into Europe?
No, Laura, I think there is zero possibility of a military solution. This is a classic example of the kind of problem that requires some military, but absolutely economic, diplomatic, political, cultural, communication. This requires a 360 set of tools.
None of which seem to be there. And now we're hearing reports that the US administration is monitoring of a Russian military buildup inside Syria. How concerned are you by what could be a Russian attempt to back up President Assad?
I think it is counterproductive. Russia would be very welcome to join the anti-Islamic State coalition. At last count, there were 45 nations in that coalition, along with the United States and almost all of the NATO nations. But simply inserting itself into a brutal civil war on the side of a horrific regime is only going to be counterproductive and will prolong the violence, unfortunately.
How about this administration's attempts to back up the moderate Syrian rebels? It doesn't seem to have had much success so far. Do you have confidence it could work down the road?
I think over the long distance, there's some possibilities. But in the short term, Laura, as you know, that program has not succeeded. Small numbers, probably excessively high standards of vetting, not a lot of enthusiasm on the part of the Syrian people. Thus far, that side of the equation has not been very successful.
And how big a concern do you think it is for your former colleagues at NATO, this exodus, the influx of migrants?
Extremely concerned, and on a couple of levels. First and foremost is the human crisis of this. Thousands of people drowning at sea, hundreds dying trying to cross these very dangerous borders, young children, young women becoming victims to these smuggling outfits. It's a terrible human crisis. Secondly, within that slipstream of humanity, Laura, hundreds of thousands of migrants moving, the jihadists will be able to insert themselves and come into Europe proper. That's a very bad combination, and I think from a NATO perspective, we have to take that very seriously.
Even if there is a risk of jihadists coming in with the influx of migrants, Europe is trying to resettle 160,000 refugees. There are calls here in the US by senators for America to take 65,000. What do you think?
I think the United States should take somewhere between 50 and 100,000 refugees. This is not a European problem. This is a transatlantic problem. And the essence of the NATO alliance, the essence of that transatlantic relationship is that we're partners and allies who help each other in times of need. This is certainly a time for that kind of help from the United States to support our friends and allies in Europe.
Admiral James Stavridis, thank you for joining us.
This is a time.
Thank you, Laura.
Okay, excuse me, y'all. This is a time, friends, of the breaking of the pride of the powers of Joseph, his sons Ephraim in the UK and Manasseh in the US. It's a time of things being made ready for the events of the end time that will kick off with the fifth seal opening up with a new head, the seventh and final head of a holy revived Roman Empire, a holy Roman Empire. It'll be the time of the Great Tribulation. It'll be the commencing of World War III, round 3 of World War. It'll be the time of the greatest martyrdom of God's saints ever over the Sabbath Sunday issue and bowing down to the image of the beast, which they will require. It'll be a time of God's two witnesses, and they're doing some very miraculous witness, including being able to breathe fire upon their enemies who would try to hurt them. It'll be the time when God provides the promise that he makes in Luke 21, verse 36, where Christ said, if you watch these events and pray about them from the bottom of your heart every day, praying always, he said, with the promise being held out that you may be accounted worthy to escape. So it'll be the time when those who are Philadelphia in attitude will be taken on two wings of a great eagle, whether that means literally an eagle or symbolically by a jet aircraft or some other way, like even miraculously like Elijah's chariot of fire that was God provided. God will provide a way for those who are accounted worthy to escape, and those who are accounted worthy can escape the most terrible time of trouble that's coming on this world since the beginning of the world to this time. No, nor ever shall be. The time of trouble coming is greater than anything before it or anything to come after it. That hasn't come yet, but that's the next major event in prophecy to happen. And friends, in watching news and in praying always and fervently about things, I saved this story to the last. And hopefully this will help as you do your prayers tonight, because this one has the potential of touching you deeply, as it does me. U.S. hostage Kayla Mueller was murdered by Islamic State militants and not killed in a coalition airstrike, as IS claims, according to a Yazidi woman who escaped after being held as a sex slave, one of thousands of women and girls enslaved by IS. Two Yazidi eyewitnesses have also told the BBC that Miss Mueller was used by the IS leader himself as one of his personal sex slaves. The BBC's Paul Wood and cameraman Fred Scott report from northern Iraq.
The life the Yazidis knew has gone. The people in the camps are survivors of an attempted genocide. It took many forms: mass executions, forced conversions, and slavery, a term used quite openly by the so-called Islamic State. Thousands of women and girls are still being used as sex slaves. Ours was 15 when she was bought by a 60-year-old man. He bound her hands and he raped her.
This is our religion, he said. I begged him to stop. I told him, you are now like a father to me. please don't touch me. I said, for your wife, for your children, for the sake of your God, don't do this. He said, no, this is what God wants me to do.
What happened to the Yazidis explains the fate of the American hostage, Kayla Mueller. She went to Syria as an aid worker and ended up in ISIS captivity. The American authorities got intelligence that Kayla had been moved out of prison. They were told by Yazidi girls and women who'd escaped from ISIS that she was now staying with a family. That phrase sounds rather benign, but what had really happened was much more complicated and far more grotesque. The man calling himself Caliph of the Islamic State took Kayla as a trophy. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi made her his sex slave.
2
Yazidi girls were held in the same house. They describe Kayla's ordeal, raped many times by the ISIS leader.
Kayla would be taken to another room for Baghdadi. When she came back, sometimes she just lay down without saying a word. Sometimes she would cry under a blanket. She tried to hide that from us. She didn't want to upset us. She wanted to seem strong. She did everything Baghdadi wanted. She was too afraid to beg. He told Kayla, if you refuse, I will behead you. He gave Kayla a Quran. He taught her about Islam every day. I asked Kayla to run away with me and she said, no, they will behead me. Kayla was like a sister or a mother to us. When we wept, she tried to make us feel safe. She would always tell us, you will get home to your parents one day. I will never forget her and what she did for us.
There's another witness. Amsha was a sex slave for the ISIS number 2. She remembers him laughing at news reports that Kayla was killed in a coalition airstrike.
He told me they killed Kayla because she was an American. Obama could stop the Syrian regime bombing us, he said. 10 of our women and children die every day. This is our revenge.
Kayla was one victim of a vast crime. Every family in this camp has left people behind, some killed, some held in slavery. ISIS has yet to be called to account. Paul Wood, BBC News, Northern Iraq.
Friends, this next story is likely to be of great concern to Walmart in America. Reportedly, Walmart carries a lot of products from China. Growing concerns about the health of the world's second largest economy mean that the gathering of global business leaders in China's northeastern port of Dalian earlier today will be closely watched. So, as the World Economic Forum gets underway, is the Chinese slowdown being felt by locals?
Dark days ahead for workers on the factory floors of the world's second largest economy. They were once the engine of this country's economic miracle and powered growth here. But China is moving away from this model, and it's slowing down. Chow Ao has worked here for the last 4 years, making parts for bigger machines. Just a few months ago, he was constantly busy, working round the clock. But that's not the case anymore.
Our orders have been falling from the beginning of this year, and I'm not doing as much overtime these days as I used to, when business was good. We're not as busy as we used to be.
This looks like a lot of abandoned factory equipment. The factory's owner told me that lots of businesses here are at risk of shutting down in this industrial district.
I've seen orders fall by 30 to 40% since June. This month, I can still survive. But next month, if the situation doesn't improve, I'm going to have to start laying people off.
And far away from the factory floor, another pillar of the Chinese economy is also suffering.
Ever since the 2008 financial crisis, cheap and unchecked credit helped to fuel the massive property boom here, which in turn helped to boost China's economic growth rates. But take a look around. Tens of thousands of uninhabited and abandoned flats in this township alone, part of an estimated 70 million unsold homes across the country. Developments created for a middle-class population that never showed up.
As China's economy changes, it has to create jobs for young graduates like Zoe. The daughter of factory workers, she's one of 8 million that enter the workforce every year with high hopes for the future.
We can make more money nowadays, and because we are graduate, we are educated people. So I think my children, they can have a better resources or better environment to do whatever they want.
China says this is the new normal and that its economic future lies in its young consumers. But the transition from the old economy to a new one is painful. And managing these expectations will be one of the government's key challenges ahead. Karishma Vaswani, BBC News in Dalian, China.
Friends, in spite of the slowdown, the devaluation of the Chinese yuan, it's maybe kind of like the cocking of a gun. You know, you stop, pull back, cock the gun, and boom, you spring forward, you shoot forward. And part of China's aim is to have the Chinese yuan become a reserve currency. They'd love to become the world standard and for the value of everything and replace the American Yankee dollar in that position now. And there's no change. In spite of this economic slowdown in China, the devaluation of the yuan, there's no change in the news reports we've been bringing you about China building up its military. And especially very recent news with its naval fleet having one of its large destroyers having been seen recently off the coast of Alaska. And we'll be keeping an eye on that and probably bring you some stories on that as we go. You know, we should all want to keep an eye on China. China was a big player in the Pacific theater during World War II. Thank you for joining us. That's it for this Wednesday night. God willing, and the creek don't rise, friends. We'll be back again tomorrow night, Thursday night, with the day's current news related to the Bible and prophecy here on Nightcast. Until next time, this is your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying so long and good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on COGTV.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the COGTV.org video archive.